Hey guys, welcome back to the One Room Schoolhouse. Hopefully you guys had a good weekend. We thought this week we'd spend a little time going over some biographies. One of the things that we have at WallBuilders is a whole series of biographies of, I guess, really kind of historical heroes. Most of them are from America. In the series, there's a few people that are missionaries. But generally speaking, we're going to highlight some of the American heroes. And we thought one of the first guys would be the most fun to start with.
Davy Crockett.
Davy Crockett. Now, if you have not been blessed to grow up in understanding Fess Parker, Disney, Davy Crockett, King of the Wild Frontier.
If the name Davy Crockett doesn't immediately cause you to want to sing the theme song, you need to go back and fix that.
Okay, and if you can't join in, born on a mountaintop of Tennessee, greenest state in the land of the free. If you're not singing along right now, again, you've missed out so much. If you don't have Disney Plus, that's fine. Get the DVD. Just go to YouTube. Watch the theme.
They're so good.
Yeah,
so good.
Davy Crockett, right? Certainly one of the more iconic American figures. So many movies have highlighted him. Yeah, I mean, really every Alamo movie, Davy Crockett's kind of the main guy. So John Wayne, Alamo, and really after Fess Parker and John Wayne,
hard to follow.
There's no way you can do this better. So there have been some attempts.
Yeah.
2004, I think.
Billy
Bob Thornton.
Yep.
Yeah, made the attempt, and right, that's fine. Make the effort, but after John Wayne and Fess Parker, it's just not getting much better. Davy Crockett, really interesting guy for lots of reasons. Certainly Alamo not being the least of those.
Yeah.
But back up to the middle of the War of 1812. There was also a Creek Indian War going on, and Davy Crockett from Tennessee, he signs up to be a scout, and he's actually serving under Andrew Jackson. So he knows Andrew Jackson fairly well. Davy Crockett then is part of the state legislature.
Yeah.
He then is eventually elected as a congressman. As a congressman,
goes to D.C.
He's one of the guys who strongly opposes Andrew Jackson and a lot of the Indian removal, a lot of what Andrew Jackson was doing. And so one of the things that, as we look at history, there's some moments in history when certainly there were people who did some very bad things, and we acknowledge that. And Andrew Jackson, considered really kind of the founder of the Democratic Party, the donkey for the Democrats, that being the animal of the Democratic Party, is because of Andrew Jackson. Except they didn't call it a donkey; they went King James style, right? And they said this dumb old. Right, King James, right, the donkey. It's
just my ears.
Right, okay.
Yeah.
So King James,
Politics.
He was an ass, is what it was. Okay, it's King James, we're fine. Okay, just quoting the Bible here. But it was that they were known as the party of that dumb old donkey, and Andrew Jackson was like, that's fine, we embrace it.
Leaned into it.
He absolutely leaned into it. So Davy Crockett was opposing a lot of the Democrat measures, what Andrew Jackson was doing.
And he actually got criticized a lot for this. By obviously the people of D.C., but even by his constituents. They actually called him back. But when he went back to Tennessee to explain why he went against Andrew Jackson's policies, he said, look, when I went up there under the assumption that I would stand by the principles of the guys of 1776, the principles of our forefathers, and any time I saw new principles being added into government, I resisted those. And when Andrew Jackson started doing that, he started resisting those as well. He went around the state, and eventually, a lot of the people in Tennessee began to realize, okay, Davy Crockett's still our guy. But he actually went through a period of political exile there because he was bucking the trend so much. And he said, look, whether it benefits me or not, I'm going to stand by my principles, and was really steadfast in that regard.
Yeah, and this is one of the things that is also kind of fun and interesting looking at American history, because there are a lot of complexities in different areas. And certainly looking at Andrew Jackson, Davy Crockett, you see some of the complexities even with some of the warfare with some of the native tribes, right? So the Creeks, there was this massacre that kind of led to the Creek War and the massacre of Indians killing settlers. And so there was a lot of, again, complexity. There's a lot of details to the story. And oftentimes in history, it's painted with such a broad general brush that good guy, bad guy, and sometimes there's more to the story where sometimes good people make bad decisions and bad people sometimes can do something right. So you really need to kind of see more of the story. So after Davy Crockett, though, He opposes Jackson. He loses election. He then gets reelected. He then loses election. But the whole time, his folklore has been building. Because he was known as a really good storyteller. He was an outdoorsman. He was a woodsman. Only appropriate.
The classic,
right?
Yeah.
The old coonskin cap. And
this is not his original coonskin hat.
That's true. It's not.
But
it probably came from like Cracker Barrel or something. I don't know. But
yeah, and I mean, even later, obviously, during his lifetime, a lot of people started telling stories, especially after his lifetime. We mentioned the movies and stuff. This is a really fun kind of almost dime store novel. It looks like he's got a 1911 pistol instead of the cabin ball.
It's supposed to be a revolver.
Also, the face on the bear just cracks me up. He is certainly worried.
And this is when he's a boy.
Yeah.
Is the way that is done. So certainly we're not encouraging boys to go fight bears with a knife and a revolver.
Yeah.
It's not what we're saying.
But to mention that he was such a good storyteller, he even wrote some of those stories down. This is actually an early autobiography by him. It was written, obviously, before he went down to the Alamo. You can see, again, him fighting the bear right there. And his it's really funny, his coonskin hat is substantially different. It kind of almost looks like a wolf or something, but it still has the eyes and ears on it in that picture. But this is one printed in 1945, written obviously earlier. But in this, he is going from town to town across America, kind of touring around. And one of the towns he goes to is Boston. And while he's in Boston, obviously a lot of the notable people are coming and meeting him. But one time, he's at night, he's out at the tavern getting some food, and a young boy comes in there and starts, tugging on his leg and being like, "Hey, excuse me, Mr. Crockett." And he turns around and looks.
Which is probably not a new thing, right? For Davy Crockett to have some little kid come up, want to meet him. Yeah. He's used to being semi-famous because, again, he's kind of this frontiersman. Yeah. He's an outdoors guy. He was a great storyteller. And the whole time he's in Congress, he was a defender of kind of oppressed people in ways. So he was very beloved by many people.
So he turns around and he sees this kid, but he realizes this child is actually blind. And the kid goes on to invite Mr. Crockett to come out to the school for the blind, and he kind of looks around. He's like, "Really? Can you lead us there?" And even the other guys that are around him, like, "Yeah, that kid can get anywhere around Boston just as well as anybody else can." So he follows the child to the school of the blind, and he gets there, and he is amazed by what he sees because he gets there, and to entertain him, one of the kids asks if Crockett would like to hear her read. And he's like, "I would love to see that."
And right at this time, blind people reading was a very new thought.
Yeah.
It was a new thing. So this would, right, when this blind girl says, "Mr. Crockett, would you like to hear me read?" And he's going, "Well, yes, that would be great." But you can imagine, he's thinking, like, this is not really possible, right?
Well, he notes that she grabs this huge volume. And,
huge
this
volume.
is a big one. And she opens it up and then proceeds to find a chapter in the Old Testament and begins reading it. And he went and looked around behind her and he saw this exact style of volume. And you can see this right here. All these letters are actually raised. They are actually pressed through on the other side and then pasted together. But what they would do is they would run their finger across the page, and those raised letters, they would be able to feel it.
So this is pre-Braille, right?
Yeah.
So before there was Braille,
hadn't been invented
it's just, it's normal kind of letters, the normal spelling that we would have on any book we would read. It's just the letters, as Jonathan mentioned, have been pressed out of the page. So as you run your finger across it, it's just like the letters from a book we would have, and they were using this book, and they read. So this little girl reads to him. So Crockett is super impressed. After she reads to him, they then ask if they would like to hear them play music, and Crockett's like, "Okay,
absolutely,
yes, let's listen to the." So they have this band with all different kinds of instruments. So Crockett is super impressed because his school for the blind was doing things that really he was not aware that blind kids could even do on this level. Because certainly, if you have a blind band, right? I mean, how do you read music? And obviously, you're playing by ear on some level. And so, just very impressive stuff he discovered. It wasn't long after this, because this is kind of at the end of his political career. 1835, he goes to Texas. where us as Texans, he is in our Texas Hall of Fame forever. Because the next year you have the War for Independence, you have the Alamo, and kind of the end of Davy Crockett's life. And there's even there's some discussion about really how that all came to be. Nonetheless, one of the things that we certainly are encouraging, and we have several books, this being one of them, these were biographies done for students in school. And so certainly with people being home now, parents, if you're looking for something fun for your kids to learn some of these stories, this is a fun way to learn stories. On the WallBuilders website, we have several dozen different stories. So just biographies, and I'm saying parents for kids, right? But if you're an adult and you're thinking, I don't know this story, I'd love to learn more, these are fun ways to learn more of their stories.
Yeah.
And they were written by people who not only wanted to capture the story, but who were not shying away from some of the religious aspects. Where for Davy Crockett, for example, one of the things that was noted even at the Alamo is before they went out for this kind of last stand of the Alamo, he went to the chapel and he prayed, asking, but presumably God to help them in what they were doing before he goes out. And so it just highlights some of these people, not just their stories, but how faith was a part of some of their stories. So it's a cool way to learn more of their story. Davy Crockett is a name most people know. Again, if you have not seen the Fess Parker, Davy Crockett, King of the Wild Frontier, it's great. You can watch John Wayne's Alamo, also awesome great. Yeah. Right? So this story has been told some, but it's just one of those stories that for many people, and especially modern generation, we just don't know these stories anymore. So he's a fun guy to look at. A second person will tell you a little of the biography, and we'll plug that also you can find this book if you want to read more of the biography, is Francis Scott Key. And Francis Scott Key is someone whose name is fairly well known because he wrote the Star Spangled Banner, right? The national anthem. Except today, he certainly is becoming a villain, kind of like a Christopher Columbus, like many founding fathers.
Yeah.
And that's really only acceptable when you don't know who he was and what he did.
Exactly.
Because even though, we say this a lot, our starting place with history is that all have sinned and fallen short of the glory of God. So certainly Francis Scott Key was not a perfect person because we think everybody's jacked up and needs Jesus, right? So if you're watching, if you don't know Jesus, you should look him up, right? Google, do a little research, get the Bible out, study. We think everybody needs a Savior because none of us are perfect. So the argument is not that he was perfect, but what he is accused of today, most of it is flatly false and ridiculous when you know the story.
Yeah, so obviously he is the author of the national anthem. We actually have right here in this book basically one of, if not the first printing of the national anthem. You can see it's actually called The Defense of Fort McHenry.
And this was the first time it was ever printed in a book. It's in this book.
And obviously it goes down, the words, "Oh, say can you see by the dawn's early light." I will not attempt to sing it. I will spare you all of that. But where a lot of the now controversy comes from is actually in the third verse. And as you go through, "And where is that band who so vauntingly swore that the havoc of war and the battle's confusion a home and a country should leave us no more? Their blood was washed out of their foul footsteps pollution." Turn the page. "No refuge could save the hireling and the slave from the terror of flight or the gloom of the grave." And then it has the refrain there. And nowadays, right, you have the Colin Kaepernick protests about the national anthem.
Right, because it says
the hireling and the slave, right?
Right, so the argument, well, clearly he must have been pro-slavery then, and that's what the third verse, the stanza, right, was about, was slavery. Except it wasn't.
Except, right, why is he writing this? Well, it's in the middle of the War of 1812 against Great Britain. Well, why did that war get started? It was largely because the British, for honestly a long time, over a century, had a policy that was called impressment. And so what they would do is, wherever they were, they would oftentimes board ships or even sometimes raid ports, and they would force people into the service of the Navy.
Now, you've probably seen the movies, right, where these guys go into a bar and somebody's getting them a bunch of drinks, and then they wake up and they're on board a ship and they're like, crap, right? And then they have to serve on the ship. They've been impressed. That was the idea, right? These British guys would come along, knock them on the back of the head, knock them out and drag them to the ship. They wake up the next day and, hey, you're working on this ship. You oppose us, we kill you, right? Whatever the case is. Yeah. Pretty drastic, but that's what this impressment was. And this is what the British were known to have done for a long time.
And we actually have, we showed y'all one of the other weeks, all of our newspapers over there, we have dozens of newspapers from the War of 1812 talking about this policy of British impressment, only from the American perspective, they weren't impressed, it was enslavement. So they would call it...
I see what you did there. The Americans weren't impressed, but they were impressed, just not like impressed with the impressment. So, okay.
Anyways, I'm sorry. That was for you, Dad. But the Americans, this was obviously slavery because they were getting kidnapped, forced to work, so that's what they called it. And that is by and far most likely what Francis Scott Key is referring to.
And so Francis Scott Key, even in that, is not defending the position of slavery.
Absolutely
and
not.
The reason we can verify he wasn't defending the position of slavery is because he was, in fact, a lawyer. And Brandon, if you remember the reason he was aboard ship that night, he was part of a team going to negotiate the release of prisoners. But in the midst of his being a lawyer, many of the cases he had actually dealt with the issue of slaves in general.
And this is actually one of his legal briefs as a lawyer. You can see his handwriting right there. But while he was a lawyer, he actually worked on over 90 cases, specifically in Washington, D.C., arguing for the freedom of slaves. And he actually successfully won the emancipation of over 200 people who had been slaves during that period, and that was over the course of about 36 years. So for nearly 4 decades of his life, both before, I think the first one was in 1806, and the last one was the year before he died in 1843, I believe. So for nearly 4 decades of his life, he worked in the courtroom, mostly pro bono, right, without obviously being paid, because
the slaves can't pay him.
How could he get paid?
Right.
And was able to liberate over 200 people by himself, and that's, just him, not even including some of the other things he did.
And right, this is not to say, again, it's not to say he was a perfect person and didn't make mistakes.
He even had slaves early on, but he freed them, and then he started freeing everybody else that he could.
And one of the things we talk about is for many people in American history, and actually world history for that matter, there were people who were brought up in a culture where something was permissible, but somewhere along the way they realized, wow, this really isn't good, this isn't appropriate, we shouldn't do this. He became such a noted defender of African Americans, of slaves, that those who were supporting slavery, who didn't like him, actually called him that in lawyer. Oh, Key, he's that in lawyer. Well, the derogatory N-word, right? The one we're not going to say. If that is what you are being labeled because you are on the side of the African Americans, or in this case maybe the Africans, maybe they weren't even African Americans, they were just Africans in general. But if you're on the side of black people who have been oppressed, who've been enslaved, who are slaves, and the people who don't like you are calling you a defender of the black people in a derogatory term, again, there's so much more to the story, and this is why little biographies like this can be helpful, because when you start to learn more of the story, then sometimes you realize, okay, so this one bad thing that's being said, maybe that's not really entirely the story, really accurate.
For sure.
Which is certainly, when you look at the Star-Spangled Banner, which is kind of what brought him back into the conversation again several years ago, it's just a lack of history that allow people to make such foolish statements. And it's a lack of knowledge from the general public that allow those statements to kind of go by and not be openly criticized immediately by the majority of the population because they don't know the story. So one of the things we're going to do this week is try to just recapture a few stories, give you a few details, and then let you know there's some great bios out there if you want to read it. Obviously, you can get online, you can do some research, but there's a lot of questionable articles as well as probably some good articles. So be careful where you look. Certainly, we do encourage you to check out WallBuilders.com. We have a lot of articles on our website. And if you have questions this week, put them in the comment box. We are still praying for you guys. Jonathan, anything before we sign off? Okay, great. So we'll see you guys tomorrow.